Another episode 42 Wardens Watch. That's great. But there's some pretty cool things going on. And boy, you kind of shocked me when you put out that video of your knife that came over Instagram and Facebook. It was like, talk about a professional job and showing somebody how to use your knife. It was just, it blew me away, and it blew a lot of people away because I got a lot of responses. A lot of people were asking about your knife, and can you give us a little history? I mean, yeah, it can't get much better than that video, but maybe some back.
Yeah, Wayne, for sure. And before we go any further, I gotta give a shout out to my good friend Rick Stewart, who is the senior producer of American Zealot Productions that put that commercial for the Trailblazer thin green line folding knife. He, did our Patriot Profiles Life of Duty series for NRA TV, was a top hit on Sportsman's Channel back in the day, and just does quality work because he believes in good product if they support a good mission. And as you know, the whole thing about my Trailblazer thin green line folding knife, and it's an everyday carry folder, and it was kind of designed to be the knife I never had in almost 30 years of being a game warden. And all of us on the game warden conservation thin green line front, we rely on our knives, right? We carry them every day, just like everything else on our belt, our gun, our defensive tools,
Right.
you name it. So yeah, really fortunate to be sponsored by V Knives, which is Mike Bellecamp's company out of Washington, and he's been designing knives for 30, 40 years himself. And we made this thing to kind of have a little bit of everything: a glass breaker, to get emergency access or exiting a vehicle if you're trapped, anything like that, a seatbelt cutter, or an emergency harness cutter that has its own razor blade. So when you do cut through harnesses and webbing for any reason, you don't dull the D2 steel blade. And this is a razor sharp blade made to really, really hold up, hence using high carbon D2 stainless steel in it. Drop point design, because us being game wardens, we need a drop point, right? We got a skin, gut, feel, dress.
Right.
We're offering them in serrated, partially serrated, for those of us that cut through really crazy stuff, especially tactical guys on teams or survivalists. And then we have non-serrated versions as well, because some people prefer a straight edge and not having to deal with resharpening the tougher little cuts on a serrated blade. So yeah, the whole package is pretty light, pretty small. You get a waterproof O-ring gasket sealed box with the knife that you can put other valuables in and use it for something other than the knife to keep things watertight, ammunition, identification, whatever, in a survival pack. And then you get a full complement of tools too with the knife that give you all those extra screws that sometimes come missing from your belt clip, and you go, dang it, how do I get more screws? And you got to, call a manufacturer and wait a month. Well,
Right.
we have that included with the tool. All the extra parts are in the box. So this thing is made pretty much to be a one-off for anybody to not only use, but then to maintain. So, and we built them to be used and used hard. On the black handled one, you can see kind of inside the scales, Wayne, it's got the thin green line runner. Definitely a nice, kind of attractive part of the knife, but that's symbolizing everything we and anyone else that is concerned about our environmental resources throughout the entire world are behind the thin green line.
That is awesome.
We also offer them in OD green handled, because for the tactical types and the outdoor hunting types that don't want a black handled knife and want to kind of run something kind of cool and kind of blending with their camo or their battle dress uniform, the OD green handles work nice. So yeah, it's the thin green line Trailblazer from V Knives, and they can be ordered directly through me if they want a personalized pack, or they can go to our website at vknives.com, vknives.com, and see that and about 60 or 70 other cutting products we have for sale.
And for those that are actually watching this on Patreon, you can see John actually displays his knife and talks about it. So if you're on our Patreon site, you can actually see the podcast and see John doing this. And I remember one day we were podcasting, and I keep hearing this click, click, click. I'm like, John, there's a clicking noise. What is that clicking noise? You got to, and he's like, I'm flipping my knife. So that's an automatic release, isn't it? Or is it assisted?
I'm glad you brought that up. It's not assisted because we wanted this thing legal all over the country, and we didn't need it to be. And something Mike Bellecamp designed and pioneered on a knife design on a different knife called the Jerry Hossam, who's a Hall of Fame blade maker. his deplorable knife that Mike built with him. When I handled that knife, I had never seen a camming mechanism like it, Wayne. And I immediately got excited because this little lever right here actually becomes part of the tang, and it's basically a blade guard when you're working the knife hard, but that's the lever. And on a single ball bearing, you get that fast lockup, but it's not a switchblade. It's not spring assisted. And then now look at the lever. It now becomes that area where I'm going to hold
Yeah.
that knife. And then with these serrations cut in the top, when I'm really driving the knife, I'm protected from this thing coming back, or, you know, my index finger getting jammed up on the serrations, or that really, really sharp straight blade. So it's an ingenious design that has very little moving parts, kind of like a Glock
Yeah.
pistol. Why I like Glock so much. Less is more. And that's how this knife's designed, and it is just butter smooth.
No, I'm
So
glad you showed
that particular
that.
mechanism is kind of favorable for most people when they see it firsthand. Yeah.
And it's fast, it's efficient, and it makes that clicking noise. So
Yeah. One more time, just for our viewers, because it just
yeah.
sounds so cool. Why not? There's a click.
And
Yeah.
it comes out so
I don't,
fast you would think it was assisted or something. I always did until you pointed that out, and that it's just very, very well designed, John. I will say that just an awesome job for any outdoorsman, any first responder to have that on their hip really quick to get to a vehicle, to cut somebody out of a seatbelt, to break that window. All the things that you need extremely fast is right there. So well done. That's just awesome. And the other thing
Thanks,
is,
brother. Yeah.
yeah,
Thank you.
is what you bring to the Warden's Watch. I will say this interview that we did with Nancy Foley, just
Oh,
top
amazing. Yeah.
notch. And I know
Yeah.
you worked with her. You always spoke very highly. And after doing this podcast, I can really see why. She's just a dynamic woman that has made a big difference in wildlife law enforcement. It was dynamic. It's awesome.
Yeah, she really did. You know, obviously it's near and dear to me because I did work with her in the field right at the start of my career, and then got to see her move up through the ranks, always with the field in mind first, and always with a progressive vision for the agency for the benefit of the resource. And without giving too much away of this great podcast we had with her just last week, um, she made a big difference, and she allowed guys like me and other progressive thinkers in the agency to kind of flourish and do some good things, I think, for the resource that were pretty unconventional at the time. And we get into that and so much more in the podcast. It was one of our just an amazing conversation with Nancy, and I know you guys out there listening and watching are really going to enjoy it because she's quite a character on all levels.
Yeah, and which brings me kind of to our next podcast, because through the conversation that we had after about Nancy, you started talking about some of the undercover work that you guys did in California, and I
Yeah.
was like fascinated with the case that you were talking about, and so we kind of decided that we should have a podcast regarding this case. So that's going to be following this, a California case that you were involved in, and I think Nancy was somewhat involved in it as well. Is that correct? Or
She was, at the time, she was the chief overseeing the agency.
okay,
So she
so
was
she was
definitely
involved
seeing
in
it
one
from
way.
that. Absolutely. She was on
Yeah.
that bird's eye view. And yeah, we worked with her old team, the special operations unit, the covert unit, because without giving it away, it got so dark and deep down the rabbit hole of really heinous wildlife poaching all over the state of California, that us guys on the patrol front really got into more than we could handle, and it just became this great joint case between us and their team that we initiated in the Silicon Valley of all places, and it took us all over the state in national parks. And we'll just say that for our viewers and
Yeah.
listeners. And
Nope, I
I'll
know
get
I
to
was on the
tell a
edge of my
pretty
seat when
fun
we were
story.
talking about it, and yeah, I'm like, that's a podcast. So you guys will have to check out episode 43 for the details to that case. So here comes Nancy. Sounds great.
We are super excited today to have retired Chief of the Law Enforcement Division of California Department of Fish and Wildlife, Nancy Foley, with us today. Nance has had 25 years as a game warden. She started in district patrol, worked in and ran our special operations covert unit, and spent the latter part, a good majority of the latter part of her career as badge number 1 for all the game wardens in California and my chief. So Nance, welcome to Warden's Watch. We are so happy to have you on the show. And how you holding up out there on the West Coast?
Yeah, well, thanks, John, and it's great to see you. We're doing okay out here. You know, we're still fighting the battles, COVID. I'm lucky to live in a really amazing place. I live on the beach in the central part of California, so we don't have as many people as LA or San Francisco, and I can still get out and ride my bike or fish off the bluffs or something like that without a million people right next to me. But it certainly has had its effects.
Yeah, and some of the stuff you're doing since retirement, and I'm not going to jump too far ahead right now. We're going to get into it, as we break down your history and experience. But a lot of the international stuff to expand the fingering line message and integrate relationships, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But sadly, that has really been hindered with COVID, obviously, and some of the travel you guys do on the international front, and the stuff Wayne and I are doing even as well. And how have you guys adjusted to that, and how are we looking, just for the next year or so on outreach operations on your end?
Yeah, so I work with the International Conservation Chiefs Academy. It's sponsored by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and INL, State Department. And it's just an amazing program. It's about we really teach about adaptive leadership, and that leaders can come from any place in the division. We have positions of authority, which might be the chief's position, but everybody places their expectations on that one position. And what really needs to happen is leadership comes from all levels. And depending on the situation, anybody can step into that leadership role. And we also are trying to build this network to beat the network of wildlife traffickers. In many of these countries, like in Africa and in Asia, you have countries that are sizes of some of our states, and they just cross borders left and right. And because of that, it makes it very difficult to track them. So we're trying to build this network where people can communicate across borders and give information, give ideas, talk about people that are suspects in Nepal that cross into Bhutan or India. And I was just making a note this morning. So far this morning, I've already talked to somebody in Bhutan, Costa Rica, India, Malaysia, Nigeria, Kenya, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, DRC, and the Dominican Republic. So, I mean, that's what it's going to take, right? It's going to take that network communicating across country lines that will help us do a better job with stopping some of this illegal wildlife trafficking. And the International Conservation Chiefs Academy is what's putting all of that together.
It's really cool to see what you guys are doing there, because I know toward the end of my career, especially with the special operations lean, and as you were retiring as our chief, wildlife trafficking was becoming the hot button issue everywhere. I mean, obviously all the states were forming specialized teams. We did it in California. You're seeing it internationally, and it's just so good to see you and these groups and organizations and all of us branching out that far and helping and educating at the source and on the end side when we receive it here in the U.S. Wayne, you've been doing a lot with the Chiefs Academy as well, and this seems to be the wave of the future, appropriately so, as we continue to progress in wildlife law enforcement.
Yeah, no, working with International Wildlife Crime Stoppers, again, it's been a pleasure. And Nancy and I got to chat a little before John got on, and when you go to certain places and you keep hearing that same name over and over, Nancy Foley, Nancy Foley, Nancy Foley, that's when you really know you want Nancy Foley on Warden's Watch, because she has such an impact. And in my short time speaking with her, I can see I got schooled several times, and I could see why her name is brought up all the time with people I respect, even though I've never met you, Nancy. So I just wanted to say that, and just certainly a privilege. And yeah, I think, after being a game warden for so long, we did the best job in the world. We all look, at least I did, John did, I think you did, we looked for that next step, because it's hard. I tell everybody, I felt like I jumped off a cliff when I retired, and I was waiting to land, and I'm like trying to figure out what's my parachute. So, and podcasting came up and seems to be doing well and telling these great stories of conservation officers around the country and hopefully around the world. It's just been a pleasure to do that and to promote them, because we've all kind of been on TV before with Wild Justice, Northwoods Law, and I will say that certainly has helped this podcast elevate itself so fast with those types of people and with the officers, which I thought was really strange at first because I didn't think we'd have officers listen, but we all sit around and we tell our stories, and that's the public likes to hear our success stories as well as our not so successful stories. I've found out too, because there's been a few times I've been holding the bag and didn't catch the poacher, and I think that's important that they know that we're out there trying, even though we couldn't catch them all the time, and tell our success as well as, the things we learned from as we went on. So just your experience, Nancy, 25 years, and you've had some dynamic things in California. And first, when I talked to John about the Met team, that was an eye-opener in itself. A game warden, tactical team, eradicating marijuana. I'm like, who thinks up this stuff, huh? It's got to be West Coast. But I'm a little jealous at the same time. So, and John always
biased, we like to be progressive.
Yeah. And you were the beginning of that, Nancy, weren't you? That team was under your leadership, correct?
Well, some of it certainly was, but it's not me. It's a team. For the first time we were allowed to function as a team. And great ideas come from many more people than just one at the top. And that's kind of that leadership thing that I was talking about.
Yes.
Is that it has to come from all levels. And you can't place all of your expectations on the top person. It has to be this group think. And that's one of the reasons that diversity in our cognitive thinking is as important as our diversity in our ranks.
Right.
Absolutely.
And I will say that some of these bigger states also have some amazing tactical teams. Florida. So it's not just West Coast, but Florida and Texas have some amazing teams as well. And I think that comes when you have a bigger agency.
Definitely. You can diversify a lot more when you have a bigger agency, for sure.
Right.
Sometimes a smaller agency, I think, struggles to do the day-to-days. But certainly it's getting us highlighted with the television shows, what we do, and making people aware, because so much after I retired, and doing the podcast and people watching television and seeing what we do, they always say, I never knew you did that. I never knew you did that. And it's just the education side of this is great. And the communications, because like you said, you've been talking to all those people. I think communications has been, the buzz thing in the last 10 years, probably starting with 9/11, when different agencies didn't even talk to each other about terrorists. And now everybody's trying to communicate, because we all have a little piece of that pie to put this together to stop this illegal activity, whether it's terrorism, and that overlaps into wildlife crime as well as the drug trade and everything. And just talking, because, I know locally, when I talk with Border Patrol or talk with my local police, talk with the state police, we all have a little piece of that puzzle that puts a case together. And that's pretty awesome, because you're right. It's all about working together, and then the availability of people and the wanting to work together, because that's huge. That's huge. So
I think a lot of people have been pushed down so many times. They've got really good ideas, like John. He's an idea guy. He comes up with, hey, what about this, or what about that, or whatever. But if you get silenced too many times, then they just become quiet and they just go about their day-to-day job. And it's that freedom to express ideas and have some of them taken up. Certainly can't go with everything. And I know that John and I had a couple of conversations about things that we just couldn't do at the time.
Right.
Everything takes time, especially when you're making as much change as we made while I was chief. We couldn't jump too far ahead sometimes, or else we'd get pushed way back.
Yeah, Nance, that's perfectly said, because exactly those conversations we had. And I remember in 2004, 2005, when you were, kind of the newer years of you coming in as the chief of our law enforcement division. And it was the most progressive time I ever saw in my career. I'm sure, for everybody in agency, because we were faced with the outreach opportunity of wild justice. And are we going to put our game wardens on TV? And, you and I had those conversations, a bunch of us did, with headquarters. And that was a big step, to take that chance and to get that exposure to exactly what Wayne and his colleagues were seeing with Northwoods Law that came after our show, of how much that opened the door, even though there were some risks there. And marijuana eradication, and, dedicating some of our officers to the CAMP program, the Committee Against Marijuana Planning, and integrating game wardens with Department of Justice and drug enforcement and sheriffs on dedicated helicopter teams. And some of these other agencies had never seen our capabilities. And there was a real gamble with that, and it was very progressive. And I'm grateful that you did, but it did keep that progressive trend going and show what game wardens are all about from a comprehensive standpoint. But get into the outreach. When you decided wild justice was something we would do, and a lot of states followed suit positively, including, you know, Wayne and the Maine guys over there with Northwoods Law. What went into that, and how do you feel looking at the positives, the negatives, and advantages to that program for us?
Yeah, that was I don't know if you can see how much gray hair I have, but certainly a lot of that is from that show.
Yep.
It was it was a huge draw on our officers, for sure. You know, anybody that has a camera in their car 24/7 while you're riding around, right, it's a huge lift for that officer. And initially, we had a lot of armchair quarterbacking by other officers. Like, right, they'd see an episode and like, oh my God, they walked around and they had their flashlight in their gun hand.
Right.
So whoever does that, and it was on and on like that until I finally had to send something out that says, just stop. You know, think of yourself riding around every day with a camera on you, and how many times do you make a mistake?
Right.
And, you know, we have to thank the officers that stepped up and are willing to show the diversity of the job that we do, the breadth of everything that we run into. And I think that quieted it, at least from what I heard where I was sitting. But the positive impact was phenomenal. We've been trying to tell our stories really since 1871.
Right.
And tell the importance of the jobs that we do. We have our internal outreach programs with the departments. But that first episode of Wild Justice, John, I think it had 3 or 4 million viewers across the United States. And we can't pay for that kind of publicity about the jobs we do, the quality of officers that we have, the things that we come into and in contact with, and the jobs that we do protecting the natural resources for the people of the state of California. We just couldn't pay for that. And I thought it was phenomenal. We certainly had our ups and downs. It complicated some investigations. But to see at some of our big expos, to see the little kids coming up to some of the officers and thinking that they wanted to be game wardens when they grew up, little boys and little girls, it was fantastic.
Yeah, it was amazing, the reach we had overnight. And how is a little agency of under 400 officers with minimal, if any, recruiting budget ever going to get that type of reach? And I'm really grateful you made that call as our chief. And I know I don't want to speak too much and steal Wayne's thunder on that, but all the positives they've seen with Northwoods Law in Maine and New Hampshire, and all those officers I've gotten to know, especially since retirement, to this day. In fact, last night, a Canadian officer emailed me, and he was a teenager, a pre-teenager, watching us on Wild Justice, and said, I'm a game warden because of that. We get those emails today still, and those contacts, and the ability to mentor young people that all over the world that we would have never reached. So kudos for taking that hit. And you're right, as far as having the cameras with us all the time, by season 3, that was beyond grueling. But at a certain point, I think we made a big dent. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the recruitment and retention and the applications for jobs after season 1 and 2, it went through the freaking roof. And I know the quality of officers we've been able to hire, and the selection process and the diversity of people we started to get, especially veterans and women and things like that, was pretty cool to see. And Wayne, you're having kind of that same experience, right, with your exposure with Northwoods Law?
Absolutely. And I think Colonel Jordan and Colonel Wilkinson from Maine would have agreed wholeheartedly with you, Nancy, on that. How much PR can you pay for it? Because it's astronomical, the impact it's having. But as a lieutenant, I was seeing the draw on the officers. It is a lot of work. It's a ton of work that people don't see. And you get used to being a camera following around you a lot, but they don't see the little bits. Every time you do something, you have to talk about it. They have to pull you over here after you do it, and you have to talk. And what? Maybe 5% gets on, for that hour show. And
Right.
day after day after day, you're doing this, and you're talking about every little thing you're doing. And it is tough on those officers. I've seen them burn out, and it's tough, and they become very popular, and they keep wanting to see them, and they're burnt out. They've had it. So, it's tough. So it is. And I want everybody to know how hard it is for those officers to share their lives and their careers, because they bring those cameras. I've had the film crew eat at my house numerous times. Great people. We have been very lucky with the film crews and Ingle Entertainment. I'll give them a shout out too, because they've been doing it. They did everything in Maine, which was really nice, and then they came to New Hampshire, and we kind of repeated things, which
Worked out all the
bugs were
bugs.
worked out. So, that was good.
It's still a challenge, though. No matter how much you get used to them, I think it's a huge challenge. And I commend John and the other officers that were our primaries. I think the officers learned a lot along the way. And it was fantastic for us. There were some significant challenges, like I said, complications with cases, and complications with some of the local agencies. But on a whole, I'd do it all over again, and if I was sitting in that chair and had that opportunity.
Is there a case you could share that had complications? Kind of just give an idea what we're talking. Do you have a case that you had in mind that got complicated due to the filming? I could think of one in New Hampshire right off the top of my head.
Yeah, we had a pretty significant poacher that had some unusual characteristics and thought processes, and we had somebody that some of the wildlife officers interviewed who went off camera, but he was still vocally recorded and talked about the suspect. And so when they did the search warrant on the suspect's house, then the complications started with threats to the person that gave the information, firebombed his car. It was a pretty significant. Some of the smaller towns have limited staffing, right? So we think we have limited staffing in California for a chief of police to have 2 officers, and then have something like this come into their city was very tough for the city. And we had to throw a lot of resources at it just to make sure that we took care of the mess that we were in. That was just one of the complicating. We had others with people being shot with the camel crew, not our officers, but other people, and finding the victims. And so we had some complications, but again, all in all, it was a very positive thing for wildlife law enforcement to see everything that game wardens come in contact to on a daily basis.
Oh, that's great.
And certainly the canine highlights, right, Nancy? I'm seeing Wild Justice was so canine heavy, and we're all dog lovers, the 3 of us here, and all the game wardens out there. And Wayne, we've seen that bleed off in Northwoods Law with the emphasis on great dogs. Either detection or maybe we generated a lot of canine handler interest with that show. But Nance, going back, let's go back in the Wayback Machine for just a minute. And all the conversations that we had over the years, we never really had this one in any detail. When did it start for you? When did the light switch turn on when you said, I need to do this? I need to be a game warden. I need to go out and protect wildlife. This is my passion. How did it all start?
Yeah, so I probably didn't have the typical projection of most wildlife officers, but I grew up in Pennsylvania. I've always felt more comfortable outside than inside, unless I was on a basketball court. But always outside, that's where I felt most comfortable. Went to Penn State, got a Bachelor's of Science in Outdoor Recreation, worked in national parks for a while, Rocky Mountain, Death Valley, Olympic. Was involved in a hiking incident where a friend of mine's father passed away on the hike up Mount Whitney. And so we ended up moving back to California from Colorado, and I started working in Anza Borrego Desert State Park as a park interpreter. And I gave reptile talks occasionally, and I would run the roads at night looking for reptiles to see what was out on the road, to tell the park visitors, what was out there. And one night I was out there and I'd see, an animal on the road, and I'd hit the brake light, slow down, look out the window, make a U-turn, come back around. And I kept seeing this game warden truck pass me. They'd go this way, and then I'd do it again, and they'd go that way, and then they'd go that way. So I finally figured,
patrol.
You know what? Yeah, I'm just going to pull in to this campground where I lived, and I waited for them under the light, so they could see what was going on. And it was really my first contact with wildlife officers. My dad was a hunter when I was very, very young, but stopped hunting when he thought it got too dangerous. I was the youngest of 4. And my uncles didn't always abide by game laws. And so I think my dad was a little bit afraid of that. And just as a side note, my uncles have passed away, but their children are all great conservationists and are law abiding, and I'm very proud of them.
Nice.
But anyway, these 2 wildlife officers pulled into where I was stopped and asked me what I was doing, and I told them, and we stood there and talked for a while, and then they were like, "Hey, can we search your car?" And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, go ahead, search my car." And they searched my car, and of course I didn't have any reptiles in the car, but yeah, it was my first contact. And through my work with national parks, I had done some law enforcement in national parks as well. I always felt like, that was where it was for me, is to protect the things that I cared most about, being outdoors, the environment, and being able to do something about it when I saw people that weren't abiding by the laws. And a flyer came out just after that for being a game warden. And so I applied, and probably about 2 years later, I don't know if, so the process started then, right? I made the application, put the application in. I went through the testing process, got called back. They were going to start a background on me, which was difficult for them because I grew up in Pennsylvania. I'm in California now. And I had a 4-year degree, like I said, a bachelor's of science. And the person doing my background, I found out much later some things, but I got a letter that said, we're sorry that you can't continue in the process. You don't meet the educational requirement.
Okay.
And so in California, it's only a 60-unit requirement, with some science in it. And so that's kind of odd, but, I didn't know a lot about the process. So I was sad that I wasn't going to be able to do that, but okay. So I moved on to whatever was next. And then about a couple of weeks later, I got another letter that said, we made a mistake. And you are in the process. So that was great. I went for the next round, made it through everything, and went to my first day at work, and before the academy, where they gave us some of our equipment. And man, there was a lot of anger around me being there.
Wow.
Like this patrol captain that I met for the very first time, I stuck out my hand to shake his hand, and he was like, "Nope." Said, "You have to carry a gun." I was like, "Well, yeah." And I just didn't understand what was happening.
Wow.
I had no idea. My dad and mom, they taught me that I could grow up to be anything I wanted to be. And I just wasn't sure what happened. And later, after, I was pretty successful in the academy and graduated and started my career down in San Diego. And I can remember vividly stopping at a stoplight one time, and this man pulled up beside me. It was a young man, and just started yelling at me that I had his job. I had taken his job.
Wow.
Like he doesn't even know who I am. He doesn't know what I've done. He doesn't know the experiences that I've had, the studying the different environments across the United States. He had to, but I took his job. This is just so strange. What is going on here?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until years later that I realized somebody told me that I was hired under a quota system. I didn't know that. I thought I got in on, my own standing because I met everything that was there. I graduated first in my academy class. I thought I got there just because of what I had done in the past. And so I guess the story there goes to, you take a look at the about 20 women that were hired during that quota system.
Yeah.
And so we ended up with a chief, 2 assistant chiefs, several captains, many lieutenants, and a couple of the people stayed as wildlife officers, first level wildlife officers, which I totally respect. And so this is a long story to get to this, but there's got to be some barriers.
Great. Please, yeah.
In our hiring practices that prohibit some people from getting in, because all of the women that were hired under that quota system were pretty successful. Those that chose to stay were successful. As soon as the quota system was lifted, we went back to hiring what we had hired before.
Yep.
So we've got to find those hidden barriers in our practices, and it still goes on today. Not as much, but it still goes on today, to find out why we have these barriers that keep some people out. And I really think that some of it is that we have this idea that people have to hunt and fish to be really good game wardens. And I know this is hard for the Northeast because I know some of their hiring practices are all about hunting and fishing. But I can tell you that you can learn that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of hunting and fishing is about opportunity. And there are millions of people in this world that don't have the opportunity to go hunting and fishing as they're growing up. But they can learn about it when they're in there. And they might make some of your best wildlife officers. It might take them a little bit longer, but they'll get there if they have the passion to do that job. So I guess Nancy, I just got on a soapbox.
No, not at all. That's a great story because it shows where the biases were, when you started, that you weren't even aware of. And the quota system and affirmative action hiring that we had when I started, going back to 91, 92, it was the same thing. And we hear that a lot. The point you just made that, well, if you hunt and fish, you're going to be more familiar, more comfortable around firearms and people with firearms. You're going to, grow faster maybe in the career. And maybe for some that could potentially be true, but some of our best game wardens, and I think about all the ones we both trained through academies and seen their careers flourish, have come from non-hunting and non-fishing backgrounds. And in a way, maybe there wasn't a bias there where they went in more objectively and just tried to hit it a little harder because they had that discomfort level, right out of the academy. And we've seen some great wildlife officers, and I agree, it's not a requirement. I think it can help sometimes, but definitely not a requirement to be a good game warden. So didn't realize you had those type of challenges starting out of all the years. So wow.
Yeah, no, that's a great story.
There are probably a few more stories that we can tell, but I'll let some of the other people that come on, and hopefully the stories are going away. There's a much more accepting group of people, it seems like these days, because the diversity in gender and thoughts seems to be greater now than it was, when I started. So.
Yeah, we certainly see it in Wayne, in California. What we're seeing a lot of is new women officers coming right out of the academy and just crushing it. I'm thinking of on our cannabis enforcement teams, right, Nancy? Whether it's the marijuana permitting teams, the watershed enforcement teams, wildlife trafficking teams, canine handlers, and some of our best officers. And it's just really, really neat to see more and more of that diversity and that balance happening. But it's not to the level where it certainly should be yet. And I think the whole country is seeing that, especially in these times when we talk about all the issues going on related to equality and opportunity, and to see it in our own ranks. And it's kind of a hot button topic in other areas. And I'm glad you're bringing it up and sharing that. Those are tough stories. Thank you for that.
Yeah, Nancy, I always go back and I talked to about Abe in one of my former podcasts who lived in New York City, and the wildlife took him out of New York City. And it wasn't wildlife, the kids that grew up hunting and fishing brought him out. It was the robin that was sitting on his backyard. It was the birds that came to his bird feeder. It was the deer in between the strips of the apartment buildings that drew him out of New York City to become a Pennsylvania officer. And his supervisor, I met Abe at a game warden gathering, and he told me, Mark was like, Wayne, you got to interview Abe because his story is compelling. And knowing Mark for 20 plus years, I took him at his word and interviewed Abe, and it was very compelling. And to this day, that is an example of somebody that, and he tells in his podcast, he had to work his butt off in the academy because he didn't have that curve that everybody else had. He didn't have all that knowledge, so he had to really study. But he looked at it from a different angle too. So when he had to do his presentation on why he wanted to game warden, he said, I didn't have all the hunting and fishing experience. I had to bring these guys back to New York City to experience what I experienced and the reason that I wanted to have that relationship with the wildlife. And just a dynamic story. And he touched me, and I just, for that to happen, it can happen to anybody. And you hit it, it's the passion. It's the passion. When you have the passion, nothing's going to stop you. You're just going to keep going. You're going to do the best you can. Talking about Jen Wolf being physically fit, that girl, I wouldn't, that woman, I wouldn't mess with her.
Yeah. No, I don't think many people would.
Individual.
No.
Yeah, Jen's amazing. But I going back to the hunting and fishing, I really think that's about opportunity. And so to limit your selections by opportunity is difficult. You're not going to get that breadth of experience or cognitive diversity that I think we're going to need as we go forward.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nance, given those challenges coming on and those, what you were faced when you started your career with that perception, you didn't hold back. You were progressive from the start. And I remember when you talk about how you got that light switch by meeting that wildlife officer that was doing a reptile patrol. I'm going to go back in the Wayback Machine and mention how we met back in the early 90s. And I was a warden for a year in Riverside County, wet behind the ears, totally inexperienced. And we were thrown into some covert reptile enforcement operations down there in your old stomping grounds, Riverside County, Imperial, San Diego. And at that point, you were on the special operations team and you were working that as well. And out of the blue, we meet in the desert late one night. And now we're thrown into a huge learning curve for me. But for you to be in that position as a woman and to take that team where you took it and do the amazing things that were accomplished from the standpoint of commercial illegal wildlife sales. Let's talk about that a little bit. What were the challenges there? What drew you to SOU, which was such a great move and did so much for our agency at the time and beyond?
Yeah, well, thanks for all of that, John. My first exposure to special operations was during a big abalone undercover investigation. The special operations team at the time had a storefront. They were buying and selling seafood, including abalone. Abalone season was open at the time. But they had some target boats that were poaching abalone off the North Coast. And I think it happened because I was the newest officer in San Diego. And so, it
Fresh
was
face.
a couple of weeks away from home and nobody else could do it. So they chose me and I went north and we were on surveillances of commercial abalone divers for weeks at a time. They had a couple of rotating teams and found out some really significant things where through our storefront, the abalone poachers, they'd take 12 dozen abalone, but they would only report 1.2 dozen. So they were significantly underreporting abalone. And abalone is a shellfish in California that's probably one of the highest dollar value products that we have here other than caviar. And
It's delicious.
yeah, it's delicious if it's fixed properly.
But I had it
But
fixed properly, and it was delicious.
in the early 1990s, we still had a commercial fishery for it. It closed down in 1997, in part due to the poaching and then some disease. But so these people were significantly under-reporting, and the team that I was on was following these boats around, and we made a huge abalone case with two of the commercial divers involved, and kind of sucked me in from there. And the next time the team had an opening, I went ahead and applied for it and got involved in the undercover team. Then I went in and out of SOU a few times. It's a big draw, just like we were talking about with the TV show, being away from home as much as you are, and on the road over half the month. It was a pretty big draw, but yeah, that's where I found I had a lot of passion for the undercover work, spin team surveillance, because we made such big cases that impacted the resources so much.
When you followed them around, Nancy, can you kind of explain that and how you guys went about doing that, if you don't mind?
Yeah, so we developed into one of the best spin teams in the state, I would say, because we had a small number of people. When I ran the team, I think we had 7 people.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do surveillance. Some of our abalone poachers would start in Oakland or the San Francisco area at 2, 3 in the morning. They'd go up to the north coast of California. They'd dive and take often over limits, but their personal limit plus somebody else's limit that was there with them. Then they'd drive the whole way back to Oakland, store those abalone, and drive back up to another part of the north coast and dive again in another county, and then go back and then hand off their abalone to a middle person that would then go and sell the abalone. So our job as a surveillance team was to follow the suspects and the product from the time that they left the house until the time they sold the product. We made some pretty huge cases where people were making several $100,000 a year. Wow. Abalone poaching.
Wow. So huge.
Yeah, it was a great team effort. It's a lot of watching doors and following cars, but it turned out to be
a lot of binoculars.
A lot of really close work too. Spotting scopes and binoculars for sure when they're on the north coast.
Yeah.
But a lot of up close, following people through San Francisco traffic.
Wow.
And through the city of San Francisco as they're going to sell their abalone at casinos or nail salons or massage parlors or markets. It was all very interesting, all very intense work when you were following the suspects, and a lot of hours of just sitting and waiting for the door to open or the car to move or something like that. But we had a great team. Everybody had their forte, whether it was speeding up to follow the person or taking the notes down as to what we did. Everybody had a forte. So yeah, it was a great time. We made some significant cases, and that's one thing about diversity. We didn't have any other way to break into these groups because they didn't look like us and they didn't talk like us.
Right.
So the only way that we could make these cases was to follow them and make the observations.
Nope, that's really interesting. Certainly, the only exposure I've had to abalone is eating it, and that was in Oregon. And I'll never forget it. It was great, and I know it's pretty rare, and it's a commodity for sure. And I didn't realize, a couple $100,000. That's a pretty pretty good poaching livelihood, so to speak. Kind of like the elvers that we deal with on the East Coast. And yeah, no, that's neat. And yeah, undercover work is a lot of fun, like you said. But and then being not seen in some of those areas, I mean, you might have stood out in some of those areas.
Right.
So
right.
So it's
especially in clothes that you're hiding on the bluffs on the north coast and you're in camo. And you walk downtown San Francisco and Chinatown in camo, and that just doesn't work.
Yeah, that would
Yeah.
in right out there.
Complete, as we say in circles of training, that is a target indicator, sore thumb, stand out. But you know, Nancy, the interesting part about, and I was very lucky to do a lot of work with you guys, both on the patrol front and, you know, doing warrant takedowns when it was time to make the big bus, but also integrating in with your team and doing those long surveillances. And something we teach in the academy, I mean, obviously my forte always was rural and field craft, more wooded operations, getting way back in the backcountry, tactically, whatever the case may be. But it was the stuff I really learned back in the day with you guys on urban surveillance and getting in close to people and being able to shift on the fly, where, like you said, you're in camos 1 minute, you know, on bluffs in the spotting scope at hundreds of yards, and now you're on foot in downtown Chinatown, walking, trying to make observations and trying to blend as much as you can in a very culturally diverse city. And doing that maybe for 24, 48 hours at a time with little, if no breaks. That's a real drain on a game warden, no matter how motivated you are. And something we push now with cadets at every level in California, and I know other states, that you have to be able to shift on the fly and improvise and overcome and adapt so quickly. And one of the real neat things about us as game wardens is integrating that skill set, as fun as it is, but as arduous it is to make a good case. And SOU brought that, and it really was a template for all of our officers in California with the surveillance schools you guys would put us at the patrol level through at the start of our career, and working with other states. So those are some great career memories for me. And I know, you know, the young game wardens coming up in the academy just love those classes. It's one of their favorites, and they get so much out of it. And then we hope to keep them from being that quote unquote windshield warden, right? Where they just want to stay in the truck. They just want to wear a, you know, standard patrol uniform, and they want to stay near the safety blanket and not go too far and get those mistake cases, not really get those intentional resource violators. And it's cool to see what you guys were doing there, and what we're having to do all over the country now, especially with wildlife trafficking being so huge.
Yeah, it'll shift again. I mean, storefronts might be the next opportunity, or I'm not sure. Integration. We certainly did the hunting, illegal hunting guides. We helped other states out, since California sends a lot of illegal hunters to other states. We posed as those as well. And I can remember doing a lot of bear ops in Colorado, Operation Beetlejuice, and yeah, I mean, we did all of that, what we would consider traditional undercover work as well. But our focus really with the priority species in California, abalone, sturgeon, bear gull, that's where we found our success rate.
Do you have a
Yeah, it is a lot of time sitting in a car, and as young officers, that's not where you need to be, is sitting in a car.
Nope, you have to be out there among them.
Yeah.
Sure. You have when you were undercover, do you have a favorite case that you did? Was that the abalone case, or do you have Wardens Watch, the listeners just love game warden stories. So I always try to pull those out as much as I can, Nancy. And undercover, you're the first warden we've had on that really has talked about undercover. And that's pretty cool thing. I think a lot of people don't think of us, because they see us on TV all the time in uniform and dealing with the traditional things, that we have some untraditional duties as well, which come into such a broader scheme and a bigger case usually, that has a greater impact on protecting the resource, other than fishing without a license. And that's just great to bring people in to listen about those cases. Anything that sticks out in your mind? I know I hate to put you on the spot.
There are so many.
So many.
I did that for a long time.
Hard to even get down to even a top 5, huh, Nance?
Yeah, we did some amazing things. Like most game wardens, we have some amazing stories.
It just always
really,
when things fall together correctly. That's what always amazes me, because everything should go wrong and it comes together correctly. Like I remember pulling a camera off an illegal bait, and I actually had the guy, as he's pouring out the donuts, look at the camera that was probably 3 or 4 feet away from him and get a shot. you know, and then, you know, slide that across to him as you're doing the interview, because it's not me, not me, not me. You slide that and he's like, where'd you get that? Because that's the I
Yeah.
would have never thought that would have happened. Just that
Yeah.
was the best picture in the world, that got you moment. And it was
Yeah.
totally, it wasn't me, wasn't me, wasn't me. And then you slide that picture, how'd you get that? You know, it was the gotcha moment. And those are the greatest things when you have, especially surveillance. In that case, it was like 4 weeks of, you know, hiking a couple miles back into the back country in the night
Mm-hmm.
to set up surveillance and all the extra work you put on. And it was a crazy time what we were doing, and then trying to get our other duties involved in doing that
Yeah.
undercover. And, you know, the remoteness of it really was really taxing too, especially hiking at night slows you down by 2 or 3 different times, and you don't want to leave the
Mm-hmm.
sign there, so you're trying to go different routes every time. And yeah, John's shared a few of those with me. But those are that's the kind of the gotcha moment is, you know, if you ever had one of those cases that had you the gotcha, which I know you have, and it's
Oh
just,
yeah.
those are
Yeah.
fun.
So for surveillance teams, we a lot of the district attorneys, especially in the big cities that weren't familiar with wildlife cases, needed to see money exchange.
Okay.
So that money exchange was our gotcha picture.
Ah,
And just to think about trying to position yourself in a city with traffic or parking lots to get that moment of the money exchange was a real success for us.
yeah.
We worked long and hard to try and get that. We spent many hours in the back of vans uh, telling a lot of stories to get that money exchange picture. But yeah, the money exchange, and you know, the funny things that happen in surveillance or undercover work are just, we could write novels about it. But
Right.
I'll never forget this one time I worked with an officer who worked in Montana. He was one of my favorite officers in California when he was a California officer, and really
Yeah.
my mentor as a game warden, Joe Canar. And Joe left California and went to Montana, and has since passed away. But when we were in California and we worked in the undercover unit together, we often posed as husband and wife. And Joe was not married, and it
I
was,
can already hear where this one's going. This is great.
we were working a case in another state and as husband and wife, and it was so funny to hear Joe try and say that we were married. He was like, we're and I like had to whack him in the back to get the married part out. And Joe and I had worked hundreds of cases together, so I knew I could do this and do it safely. I threw in a couple of kids with him unsuspecting. As we were
It's like quite a family. Nice.
talking to the suspects, and we ended up staying with the suspects and for too long. But we ended up staying, we had to sleep in this teardrop trailer, and the suspects were really leery because they were doing a lot of lion poaching and bear gall poaching. And so we had to be very, very careful with everything that we had. And so we were both sleeping in sleeping bags on the same side of this trailer because that's what they would expect, right? And they jumped in at like 2 a.m. They just came busting through the door just to see what was going on in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Joe actually like jumped out of his sleeping bag, whacked his head so hard he almost had a concussion. And then, I mean, the place was filthy. You know, people think that it's really cool to be out going with some of these guides, and I'll tell you, they're not the pillars of society, most of them. And the house was filthy. The food, the plates were filthy that we ate the food off of. And after several days, the suspect smoked. And because I was the girlfriend or the wife, I had to sit in the middle, you know, so I was getting all that cigarette smoke. And I had to take a shower. So I go in the house and go to take a shower, and I'm standing there. There's like this much room underneath the bathroom door, and all of his kids are lined up looking under that bathroom door. So
Oh,
I was
no.
like, okay, well, this isn't going to work.
It's getting crazy.
So that was a good
Wow.
one. And, we worked many hunters in the same area. And so we had to change our appearance somewhat, going from hunting location to hunting location. So I'm not usually one to like dye my hair or anything, but I ended up as a platinum blonde at one point, and glasses and dangle earrings. And yeah, those were the days. That was a lot
Yeah.
of fun. We got a lot of people that needed to be caught. And
Nice.
yeah, I was happy for the opportunities.
Yeah, I just can picture Joe too. You put him in those positions, and and he's
Joe
got
was
no recourse. You throw a couple
no,
kids
no,
in,
no.
he's there.
Yeah.
He's not the. He's got no recourse.
You can see the sweat breaking out on
Yeah.
his head just thinking about having children.
Yeah, he's like, you wait, Nancy. I'll get you back someday.
He ended up having 2 children. His daughter is very successful, and so hopefully I broke that door down for him, to say
Yeah.
that he actually had children or think about having children.
There you go, Nance. It's just an added officer safety part of the operation, because it lended credibility. Joe knows it.
Yeah.
So Nance, no, I mean, tons of great cases, but fast forwarding just a little bit and thinking of your tenure as our chief,
Uh-huh.
what would you say is the biggest accomplishment that you were satisfied the most with during that tenure before retirement? What were the biggest challenge or challenges you faced, given the diversity of the agency, your background, and everything we face as officers on the West Coast?
So I didn't know that they had selected me. Ryan Broderick was our director at the time. And he grew up through the wildlife officer ranks. He was never our chief, but he was a deputy director for the department. And then became the director for our department. And, there were a number of people that applied for the position. And Mike Carrion, who became the chief right after I did, and I had come together, and I loved Mike, and I would have worked for him in a heartbeat. And he felt the same about me. And we both had this vision to the future of what conservation law enforcement should look like in California. And we both knew that one of us had to get that job, or else we would be possibly stuck in the same things that we've been doing in the past that didn't really bring us into the future. So I was fortunate enough to push Ryan in a direction that he gave me the opportunity to go in. And the day that they made the selection, we were all sitting around a table, all the assistant chiefs, the current chief at the time, and one of the deputy directors came in and made the announcement that I became chief. And I literally saw a wall of responsibility coming
Right.
at me. I mean, I really did. It was
Yeah.
like a visual wall of responsibility that was coming right at me, and there was no way that I could duck it. And so I took that feeling from that day, and I carried it, hopefully, for the whole term of my tenure. And that was that responsibility, not to see the wildlife officers or the division as it was, but to see how it could be in the future. Because I think that the job of the chief is really to be doing the day-to-day things, certainly, but having that vision to the future as to what's next. Where do we have to be to make ourselves relevant to the people of the state, whatever state you're in, next? How do I best protect the officers? How do I put them in the best position to be successful in the future? So challenges, well, we hadn't really changed in a very long time for a number of reasons, whether it was budget or leadership or whatever, but we hadn't changed. And we'd actually gone a little bit away from our law enforcement roots. All of our officers go through the Law Enforcement Academy. We're peace officers with the state of California first. We've got the expertise in wildlife as our secondary. And I felt a great deal of responsibility for our public safety responsibilities to the people of the state. And I knew that not many other law enforcement agencies knew that we also had that responsibility. And I felt that it was time that we took on those responsibilities and became brothers and sisters with our law enforcement community in other capacities. So we moved forward. People didn't have to write as many incident reports when they were doing traditional law enforcement, making contacts. Some wildlife officers liked it, some did not. It was like a change. And as we talked about earlier, one of my favorite sayings was, change is inevitable, growth is optional. Some people chose not to change. Other people really accepted the challenge and grew along with the changes that we were making in the division. And again, it wasn't just me, it was a whole team of people that really made it happen.
Yeah, Nance, it was neat to see that during your tenure, because we had never had such an emphasis before you came on board as our chief of officer safety related public safety missions and being prepared for it, whether it was more advanced tactical training to integrate with other law enforcement officers and be a force multiplier smoothly, equipment especially. And those of us that were part of your training staff at the defensive tactics and the firearms level, myself being one of those lucky guys, I'm really grateful to that, because we got to expose the agency and expose new and veteran officers to really, step it up a notch or two or three. And the credibility and diversity we saw, and I think the respect and legitimacy I started to see all over California with other allied agency law enforcement teams, it was exponentially bigger and better and necessary. But that was a big step. I know not everybody liked it, and some go kicking and screaming, but that's the change versus growth, as you like to say, and I like to quote as well. When you retired and you got to that point, I remember that day. That was a bittersweet day. It was a celebration, but it was tough to see you go. Of course, we're super happy for the next phase for you. What did you look back on fondly? And was there any box that you didn't get checked? Was there anything unchecked that just couldn't happen in the time frame or given where we were as an agency when you left?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my last day was really an amazing day. My father had passed away suddenly. My mother had some dementia. I needed, friends and family first, right? So I had enough time. I was pretty much maxed out with my time, and I needed to take care of family. So I could hang on until we graduated the last class that I was there for.
Yep.
So I was standing there swearing in the new cadets. And as soon as that ceremony was finished, I walked out the door. And it couldn't have been better. Really, it couldn't have been better. And the next day I was taking care of my mom, making her breakfast in Florida. So that was all fantastic. It worked out really well. And to see, it's all about that. I knew that as soon as I left that chair, somebody else was going to come and sit in it. They may take it in a different direction, and that had to be okay with me, because I wasn't in that chair anymore. But I thought I did what I could do while I was there. Things that I didn't check, John, our numbers weren't as high as I would have liked them to be. I would have liked to have had 600 officers by the time I left. I would have liked to have had a more diverse workforce. And I still regret that. That takes time, but I should have focused more on it. There's just so many things. You have a big list in front of your desk, and you check one off and you put 3 on. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to have that list in front of your desk so that you keep focus on the future, not necessarily the day-to-day things. For big things, I think we positioned ourselves well with marijuana, and I think that we needed to do more with having relevance with law enforcement off the pavement. And because that's really where our expertise is. We have plenty of officers that are in big cities and urban areas, and they do fantastic jobs there. But there are a lot of other law enforcement that can do traditional law enforcement in that capacity. There aren't a lot of other law enforcement that have the expertise that wildlife officers do off the pavement. And I wish I could have promoted that more, more traditional law enforcement, and to the public. Really, the public's where I needed to be.
Yeah, you definitely got the ball started there, though, and definitely you mentioned Mike Carrion. He came in behind you, and the vision you both shared, he perpetuated what had been started. And grateful to you both for seeing that as, you know, like you said, an idea guy, but more seeing us progressive and just growing for the sake of the resource. Since your retirement, I mean, everything from the standpoint of MET and wildlife trafficking, all these other teams that are developed, we are becoming the people that they call now for those backcountry, high risk, active shooter responses. You know, lost hikers, our canines are doing amazing work. Our tactical units, our patrol guys and women are doing great work now. And that started there with you, and kudos and thank you. It takes a long time because that's such a big change for us when you and I started. And going into retirement now, it's been a handful of years, but you didn't stop. You didn't stop being progressive with everything we talked about at the beginning of the podcast with the ICCA and the different groups you're working with. And you're you're one of the board members of the California Wildlife Officers Foundation. And as you know, that's near and dear to me in retirement. I promote it as much as I possibly can with the good work you guys are doing. But for those listeners and viewers that don't know, could you just give us an overview of what you're doing with that great foundation and what it's all about?
Yeah, it is something that I'm really proud about, John. So that in 2007, actually in 2006, one of the wildlife officers, Jerry Carnell, also featured on Wild Justice, met with one of the landowners, and the landowner didn't really understand why, when he called 911, that there wasn't a game warden that could come and help with hunter trespass on his property or poaching on his property. Just so happens that this person is a tremendous philanthropist and a great thinker. And through contact both with Ryan Broderick and myself and Jerry Carnell, this person developed a foundation, and he brought in some other amazing, generous, humble people as the founding fathers of the California Wildlife Officers Foundation. And since that time, there's we've built a corpus of several $1 million, and we treat it as an endowment. And we only use a very small percentage, just a couple of percents of a year. And we've given out close to $1.2 million to wildlife officers and their families since 2007.
Incredible.
And just last week, we gave out $80,000 in scholarship awards to wildlife officers, their spouses, and their children for this upcoming year.
Awesome.
Yeah, we protect those who protect our natural resources. We try and step in when it's not covered by government. We try to do the right thing for wildlife officers. We support the canine program. You know, if they have emergency vet bills, something like that can't be covered by traditional payment methods in an expeditious manner, we try and step in. We step in for team building, like the Baker to Vegas relay run for the wildlife officers. In the past, every officer used to have to pay for that themselves, and now we sponsor the team as it moves forward. And in catastrophic situations where we just had a young officer that lost his life to a cancer, and through John's help and V-Knives help, we had a donor that purchased 100 V-Knives, and we sold 100 V-Knives in 3 or 4 days at $100, and we gave a $10,000 check to the widow of that wildlife officer within 2 weeks of when her husband passed. We, when they had that big fire up in Paradise, California, and Thousands of people lost their homes. We had a wildlife officer that lost his home. His wife, parents lost their home. Uncles and aunts lost their home. We put a GoFundMe site up for that wildlife officer, and within a week, they had raised like $60-some thousand. And at that point, we just cut it off because there were other people that needed money, but we were able to funnel that money to the wildlife officers. So we're really there to protect those who protect our natural resources. And it's probably something that I've always felt, even as chief, trying to protect those who protect our natural resources. And the foundation is amazing. I work with amazing people on it, really giving, kind, caring. And I'm pretty proud of that.
Yeah, Nancy, kudos to that. You've done some great things. The whole foundation has, and everything you just mentioned that not every agency is fortunate to have. They make or break some programs. I remember when we were starting to, stand the Met team up, and to have money for equipment and specialized canine harnesses that we had no budget for before any of this cannabis money was rolling in. We were starting from scratch, and you guys on the foundation literally made that unit give us the ability to do our job safely by providing that necessary, tactical gear that we had just never used or seen before, and getting our dogs really dialed in for the unique, circumstances they work in on trespass grow work. And so thanks for what you're doing out there. The more we can promote what CalWAF is doing, the more I certainly will. And Wayne, I know you don't see these in all the states back east, but if these foundations can be formed up, I mean, we'd all like to certainly see every conservation agency in every state have one, especially especially agencies that are even more limited on budget than California is. And the more I talk to other agencies all over the country, the more I realize, wow, I thought we had it rough in my early days in California. Heaven, man, there is some major deficits for these smaller states and the challenges they're facing that foundations can help with. So thanks, Nance, for that. And we'll certainly keep promoting and supporting everything we can with CalWAF and everything else you're doing there.
Yeah, it's a great foundation. And again, we'll help any state. We'll give you our bylines, and we'll help in any way we can. But we think it's a really important thing to help protect the wildlife officers in the state. And every state has people that would probably step up and do it.
There's one thing, Nancy, I'd like standing up of the Met team, because that's pretty unique to California. And I know John's really, and he's been we've done podcasts about it and stuff, but from administrator, from the beginning, I just, I put myself in those shoes, and I had to put myself in the shoes when I was even doing a podcast with John as a game warden, and finding out, switching my whole thinking that this was a marijuana issue instead of it's a natural resource issue. So I changed my mind. But if I walked into the colonel's office and said, hey, I think we should start a marijuana eradication team. Yeah. It's that breaking of traditional uses and then resources and all that. But if that was in your tenure, I would like you to speak to that, because again, I always put my feet in their shoes, and I'm like, I don't think I could ever make that happen, even if and the problem you have is very unique to California, I believe. So, or maybe not. So if you could speak on that.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that you're looking to the future. What's the next big thing in California, and how do we look at that? How do we evaluate that for our officers? Is that something that we need to do? And how do we evaluate that for the natural resources? And in California, I really felt that illegal marijuana cultivation was the #1 destroyer of habitat outside of permitted construction. And that's our job, right? Natural resources.
Yes.
So it was easy for me to see the connection between working in marijuana and natural resource protection. And John and his teams, and even when he didn't have a team, and when John was working marijuana, it was a group effort with some of the sheriff's departments. They brought me enough information and pictures that could help me tell the story when I went in front of the legislature, or when I went in front of the director or the constituents, and to tell them the importance of what we needed to do Traditional law enforcement was a big component in that, but they were, again, that's our playground. Off the pavement, that's where we're the experts.
Yep.
And
Amen.
so we needed to take a leading role in that. And the destruction of the habitat, the impact to the species was so significant that I would have been remiss to not want to take a leadership role in that. And that's how I felt with marijuana. And I think that, now they're looking at what's next. After we'll stay in marijuana, but what's the next big thing in California? Ocean protection? What is it? How do you insert yourself into to maintain your relevance? Because I think, relevance is an important thing, and wildlife officers traditionally run silent and deep. We don't tell people what we do.
Right.
And without telling people what you do, they don't know how to support you when it comes to things like budgets or laws, or day-to-day things that you need. So that's another thing that CalWolf does. It's a thing that the department does, but that's why we got involved in the team. That was kind of my decision-making process. Initially, the first time we went out on some of these teams, they were just cutting down plants. They weren't doing any resource protection. It was all about plant numbers. And then we had a meeting with the Department of Justice that didn't go very well about resource protection and cleanups. And eventually, maybe 2 or 3 years into it, John, that's when they started realizing that most Californians didn't care about the plant count, but they cared about the environment and taking care of it. So that's where the shift happened.
Nice.
Yeah, Nancy, one of the biggest rewards for me and what you started, and again, grateful for this, is when we finally got past those traditional minded agencies that wanted to do the plant count and leave that Superfund site behind, not catch any suspects, not put any prosecutions forth for any deterrence. And it took, honestly, 5 to 7 years. But by the time our official Met team was formed up, and about 2 years into that, and now with the team doing it behind my retirement and yours and Mike's, it is so cool to see the other agencies that are saying, hey, we're going to supply a helicopter. We're going to bring in bodies to reclimate. We will get our investigators to do water sampling as well, because you guys are now statewide and you're one of the only teams. Seeing agencies actually get on to the conservation and environmental protection kick, coming from a non-conservation background, that's one of the most rewarding things I ever saw in the career, and I still see it. And that started right there in your tenure. So when we talk about relevance, I don't think we can be more relevant, one, when we go into a direction like this, right? But also when we get the other non-traditional agencies that aren't off pavement, so to speak, because we're telling the story and they're seeing it. And it's just been really, really good to see. So kudos and thanks again on that.
And the other thing on that is, it does break us from tradition. And what we have to remember is the mission of the Department of Fish and Wildlife in California is really broad-based. It doesn't say that the mission is just for hunters and anglers. Certainly they are where we started, and they will always be with us. But it's really broad-based, and it's about all Californians and their enjoyment of our natural resources. And the relevance part we were talking about is we have to be relevant to a broader base of people in our states to show them what we do. So Wild Justice, things Northwoods Law, the Texas Game Warden Show, that's showing everybody that it's not all about hunting and fishing, but it's about protection of our natural resources, clean water, habitat that benefit all of the people of the state. And I think that's a really important message, and it speaks to our relevance and where we're going to be in 100 years from now.
Yeah, for sure. Can you think of, as we Wayne, you have any other thoughts before?
I just think it's great that you're still carrying it on, Nancy, and it's the next step, and that you still have that passion and you're carrying it on beyond California, beyond the United States. I think you're valued among wildlife law enforcement professionals, and I just I know it's a passion. It's in your system, and I really appreciate what you're doing beyond California now. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just so happy that I have the opportunity. Keeps me connected, and I really think it is the way that we protect wildlife across the world is to be able to talk to each other. So I'm really grateful for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the opportunity. For Randy Stark, that's been on your show before. I mean, he's just an amazing instructor, has a big picture vision for leadership, and for people like John that are out there pushing the message about about conservation and wildlife officers and the stories that we have and the roles that we play.
Oh, nope, that's great. Well, I think we covered a ton of it. So, anything in closing, Nancy? Anything else? I mean, it's just your show as much as our show. That's what I like to say to the wardens. This is more about you than it is about us. Or just
any message you want to get out there?
Just how proud I am of the men and women that do this job. It's going to be such a challenge in the future with changing environment and population numbers expanding, and for them to put on their uniform every day and go out there. And I know it's a great job sometimes, but other times it's a grind. And I just wanted to say thank you to all of them, and to all of the people the other podcast listeners that support these men and women as they go about and do their jobs. So I'm pretty proud of them.
Very well said. Yeah.
Thanks, Nat, so much for coming on today and diving into some stuff going way back from the beginning and where we're going in the future. And certainly, if there's anything we can do to help your efforts, you have us on speed dial. And thanks for everything you're doing, and anything you need, you got.
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity. It certainly was a fun walk down memory lane, and I'll probably have a smile on my face the rest of the day. And the same for you and any of your listeners. If there's anything we can do to help or I can do to help, just let me know.
Great.
Thanks, Chief.